are all the materials I'll be using for my tumbler. It's very minimal materials, which is why I love this tumbler. I'm using 2 colors from Rust-o-leum. I'm using Aqua, and I'm also using the French Lilac. Both of them are satin, but you do not need to use the satin finish spray paint. Before I spray painted my tumblers, I prepped my tumbler using 180 sanding block, and then I wiped them down with 91% alcohol. So like I always show y'all, the other materials, I'm using these foils from Amazon. I'll have their link in my description below. And then I'm using the Tack-It over and over. You can purchase the Tack-It over and over from Glitter Heart Co. and I'll have their link and a coupon code below. These are the foils. They come in a pack of 5 and I really like how small they are. You can just unroll one sleeve and then you can roll the rest of the papers up back into its container, and they're really easy to store. So what I did was I started by cutting these out, and it's completely up to you. You don't have to cut them if you don't want to, but I decided to cut them just to use them easier. And then I started by adding Tack-It over and over onto my painter's tray. I did not dilute this Tack-It over and over. I just placed it on my painter's tray. And then I started brushing the Tack-It over and over, all over both of my tumblers. The reason why I'm using Tack-It over and over is because it dries sticky. So you cannot use Mod Podge for this. Mod Podge dries hard and you will not have that sticky adhesive base to your tumbler. So once I finished applying the Tack-It over and over, I let it dry. It took about 15 to 20 minutes. You want to make sure the Tack-It is very, very dry. You want to make sure it is not wet. Whenever it is dry, it does dry clear, so that's kind of a clue that your Tack-It is completely dry. So make sure that is dry. If it's not dry, when you do try to apply the foil, then the foil will kind of crumble on there and it won't give a good stick. Now that both of my tumblers are dry, now to apply the foil to the tumblers. I touched it a couple times just to make sure that it was sticky and wasn't wet at all. And I think I went ahead and I added my tumbler arm to my tumbler because it's always easier for me to work with my tumbler inside of my arm. So I have the foil, and you want the gold side or the colored side up because that's the side that's going to be up. So you want to make sure that foil side or the silver side is placing down. And all you do is you take your foil and you rub it around your tumbler like you see in the video. Give it a good rub. Don't really worry about where you're placing it. If it cuts off at the top, really don't worry about that. You just want to make sure that you press down with your fingers all around that foil and peel right up. It's easy as that. So if you notice the areas that didn't stick, it's because I went back and I took some of that Tack-It over and over off just to show y'all that if there's no Tack-It on there, the foil is not going to stick. So I try to show y'all an example to kind of give you an idea of if you don't have the Tack-It on there, the foil is not going to stick. It's simple as that. And then I'm going around and I'm taking that foil and I'm just using the excess gold that's on the foil and placing it randomly on the tumbler until I'm finished with all of that foil. So you really want to try to use all of the materials you do have, and you want to just make sure you're using all the foil. And like I always tell y'all, this is just an inspiration tumbler, so make your tumbler the way that you want to make it. Add different colors to the tumbler, add more foil, less foil, really create something beautiful, and don't overthink this. This method is very, very easy and you really cannot mess it up. Now that I place the foil on the first layer of my tumbler, I'm going back with my Tack-It over and over, not diluted, just fully Tack-It over and over, and I'm going to apply it with a different type of brush. Instead of my sponge brush, I chose I think it's a 1-inch brush, and I'm just applying it all over the tumbler again, just around it. It dries, within the 10-15 minutes. So once I put the foil on, I didn't have to seal it with anything. I'm going right back in with the Tack-It, and I'm just placing it in some spots of where I want to add that foil. So I placed that blue tumbler to the side, and now I'm going to work on my purple tumbler, adding that gold foil to the purple tumbler, repeating the same process that I did with the blue tumbler, really pressing down on that foil, really allowing that to stick and then peeling it off. You could see that I added a lot more Tack-It over and over to this purple one, so you can see all of those pieces of foil really lifting from that transfer tape and going onto that tumbler. And like I always tell y'all, don't forget your bottom. And repeating that same process that I did on the blue tumbler, I'm trying to use all of that extra foil on my paper so I don't waste any materials, and sticking it to the parts where I place that Tack-It over and over. And then adding another layer of Tack-It over and over to the bare spots and letting that sit and dry, and then we'll work on the next tumbler. I wanted to do one more wine tumbler only because I'm always so used to doing my purples and blues, so I thought I'd do a gray tumbler. I'm using the Rust-o-leum Perfect Gray, and I believe it's a high gloss, so this is really neat to show y'all that you are able to do this technique on the high gloss instead of just a satin. And I'm repeating that process, adding random spots of the Tack-It onto my tumbler. I'm gonna let that gray tumbler sit to the side, let the Tack-It dry, and then move on to this purple tumbler. I remember I already placed that second layer of Tack-It over. I'm now applying that teal foil over. Now I actually went a little too light on the Tack-It for this one. I wish I would have added a little bit more Tack-It, so a lot of that foil didn't adhere to the tumbler as much as I wanted to. So I added as much foil as I could, and then I went back and I added more Tack-It around those areas. Like I always tell y'all, you can always add more. It's harder to take away. So I'm not upset I did this. I just continued with that process and adding more in areas, and I just kind of took my time and added until I was satisfied. And then placing that purple tumbler to the side, we're going to start with that blue tumbler again and just adding the foil to that Tack-It over and over once that Tack-It is dry. So as you can see, this process is very simple. You add your Tack-It over and over, let that dry for 10-15 minutes, add your foil, add some more Tack-It if needed, and add the foil. So Tack-It, foil, Tack-It. It is very simple. I was very light-handed with my Tack-It, so if you add a lot of Tack-It and you let it to be really sticky, then you're going to have a lot of foil stick on the tumblers. This was my first time doing this process, so I added less than more because, like I mentioned before, you can always add more. So now I'm moving on to that gray tumbler and adding that royal blue. I was actually really surprised how this tumbler turned out. I really, really liked it. These aren't my colors of choice typically, but whenever I added this light blue, gray, and green together, I was really shocked with the combination. For this one, I added little strokes of the Tack-It over and over. I didn't add it on all over the tumbler, so that's why you're seeing little specks of the foil around the tumbler and not a fully covered tumbler with the foil. So by now, I hope that you understand the process before we go on to epoxy. So I finished up that gray tumbler off camera, and I'm going to go in with epoxy. For this purple tumbler, I decided to add some glitter to my epoxy. The glitter that I added is both from Glitter Heart Co. I added Tidal Wave and Cat Eye, and I just added a little bit to the epoxy. And I believe I epoxied about 10 milliliters of epoxy. That's 5 mLs part A and 5 mLs part B, totaling 10 milliliters of epoxy. It's nothing special. I just added those glitters to the epoxy. As you see, I added them both together to my 10 milliliters of epoxy. I stirred it with my wooden stir stick, and then I went ahead and I applied the epoxy right onto the tumbler like I would any other tumbler. If you do need assistance on how to mix epoxy or apply your epoxy to a tumbler, I will have a list of my help videos down below in my description below. I am using my fast set epoxy for this step, so it did dry to the touch within 2 hours. But if you aren't using your fast set epoxy, I would let my tumbler spin on its cup turner for 4 hours. After 4 hours, I will then turn off my cup turner, then let my cup air dry or air cure for another 20 hours, leaving my total drying or curing time of 24 hours. And then I wanted to add a little extra shine in there, so I took some sea turtle and I sprinkled some sea turtle over the tumbler with the epoxy on the tumbler like salt, just adding some more teal to that tumbler. And now moving on to my second tumbler, which is that beautiful gray, green, and blue tumbler. I just decided to keep that how it was because I really liked how that turned out. So I just epoxied my 10 milliliters of epoxy over the tumbler. I didn't add anything to my epoxy. I wanted that shine to just shine right through that epoxy. And then for my other tumbler, which is the light blue tumbler, I added some mixative, which you see here from Glitter Heart Co. And then I just added that mixative into my epoxy, and then I epoxied my tumbler. You can see how much I accidentally added. I added a lot. I am very heavy-handed, but it actually turned out well. I really like how that gold sat on that light blue tumbler. So sometimes the more the better, right? So after I applied my epoxy to my tumbler, I let my tumblers air dry, air cure, and then we'll move on with that next step. Once all 3 of my tumblers were dried to the touch with the epoxy, I took my 220 grit sanding block and I just sanded my tumbler down some. This is completely optional. If you put that coat of epoxy on your tumblers and they were completely flat, you don't need to sand, but I do recommend you sanding that top to make sure you have that nice seal on your tumbler. After I sanded my tumblers, I took my 91% alcohol and I wiped them down. This wipes away any of that excess sanding paper or dust that added to your tumbler. And then once I wiped it down, I added my decals. These decals will be available on my Etsy shop. I will have my decals and my Etsy shop linked in my description below. So all I did was I simply just placed them on my tumbler wherever I liked them, and then I removed that transfer tape, and then you can see how they turned out. Just keep in mind that these fonts that I chose for the designs are very thin, so your cutting machine will probably not want to cut them as well as you want them to. So just be very patient. What I always do is if it doesn't cut it, I'll change the setting to heat transfer vinyl, or I'll make the decals a little bigger. Usually whenever you have them bigger, the machine will cut them easier than whenever they are smaller. And now moving on to my last tumbler, guys, I know I misspelled a word here. I ended up taking off this decal, so don't judge. I was in a hurry. I accidentally misspelled coordinator, so I didn't seal it, thankfully. You know that happens whenever you're crafting. You're doing a million tumblers and you just look at it and you think it's right and it's not. But I ultimately didn't like the color of this decal on this tumbler anyways, so thankfully I took it off before I noticed. You can see that you can barely see what it says. I even tried to put teal over it and it still didn't work. Once my decals were placed on my tumblers, I went ahead and I placed that last coat of epoxy over those decals to give it a nice seal. I placed about 15 milliliters of epoxy on each tumbler. I wanted to seal those decals in very well. And then what you see here is me just cleaning up the rim of that tumbler, making sure I'm getting all that excess epoxy from the top. And then once I completed epoxying my tumblers, they are complete. You can see how cute and simple these tumblers are. I really like how I just slowly added that Tack-It over and over, and then I slowly added those foils on top of each color. And I left this one blank because I think there's a lot of things going on this purple tumbler, so I figured maybe just a nice name or just leaving it blank will do so, and just let the design really speak for itself. All 3 of these tumblers will be posted on my Etsy page. These are the only 3 that I'm going to have posted so far. So if you are interested in purchasing these, please check out my Etsy page. And I'm showing you a closer look to see how cute and beautiful these tumblers are. They are very simple to create. And I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more tumbler and craft videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.